Our next speaker is my neighbour in the UK, Steve O'Reilly. Steve O'Reilly comes from the University of Cambridge, so he's a professor at the university. He's also the director of the metabolic research laboratories there, and also the director of an MRC unit. And he's all those things because Stephen has made really seminal discoveries about how, so why we get fat, why we become insulin resistant, and why we develop metabolic disorders. So he's a geneticist, so he identified genes in humans that contribute to some of these disorders. So for example, he was the first to find mutations in this hormone that you may have heard of, leptin, in obese patients, in obese humans. Today he's going to tell us about hormones, genes, and human food intake.
Thank you, and thank you, Irene, and colleagues, for the invitation to this wonderful meeting. It's been a fantastic few days to have time to interact with world-class scientists and international leaders at the forefront of culinary creativity. And I've had a hell of a lot of stimulation and a hell of a lot of fun, and great food too, and I'm looking forward to more tonight. So what I'm going to talk to you a bit about today are genes, hormones, and human food intake. And I'm going to start by really telling you that a range of hormones and neurotransmitters have powerful influences on why we eat when we're deprived of calories, when we decide to stop eating, and even we're beginning to get insights into what types of food we seek to eat. I'd also like to convince you that these processes vary in efficiency between people, and that variation is largely based on genetic variation. And this explains quite a lot of why some people are very susceptible to the obesogenic environment and others are resistant to that environment. And I hope to do that in the next 25 minutes or so. We often hear that obesity is a new disease. Well, quite simply, it isn't. The Paleolithic sculptor of this Oolitic limestone figure 25,000 years ago couldn't conceivably have carved that without having visually witnessed a very obese person. And Hippocrates actually commented that obesity was bad for people's health and longevity, and said that obese people should eat only once a day, take no baths, and sleep on a hard bed, and walk naked as long as possible. And frankly, we haven't really advanced much in obesity therapy since the time of Hippocrates. In the 18th century, Daniel Lambert ran a prison in Leicester in Britain, and in the same century, a bit later, the British physician Thomas Short commented on something that we think might be unique to our era. He said, "No age has seen more instances of corpulency than our own." So it's clearly nonsense to say that obesity is a new disease. However, it is something that has become much more common. And indeed, in North American surveys, which have been pretty systematic, you can see particularly a slope of increase of obesity in males here, starting in the early 1980s and flattening off a little bit now. But that's against a background of a century or more of such increase. This is a nice data set from Union Army veterans, 40 to 70-year-old males who had been veterans of the Civil War in America and had their heights and weights measured in the 1890s. And you can see that of the 12,000 or so of those, only about 2% reached the threshold of BMI, a body mass index for obesity, compared to the equivalent age group 100 years later, where almost 30% were obese. So over a 100-year period, we've had this spectacular increase in the prevalence of obesity. And that is not unique to the USA. The increase in prevalence has happened throughout the developed world. Now, what are the explanations for that reason that obesity has become more common? I think, and I'm reasonably satisfied, that increases in ingested calories and decrease in energy expenditure is sufficient to explain that, because progressively and at different rates in different countries, ingested calories, the ability to get a calorie inside you, has got cheaper. It's got more increasingly available, both in terms of temporal availability, food outlets open 24 hours a day, and ubiquity. You can buy food in garages. The food has become more attractive because of the cleverness of food industry in trying to both convince us through their advertising to get food, and in what they've done to make food more attractive in the mouth. And indeed, cheap food, food which is full of fat and non-complex carbohydrates produces less satiety and encourages more ingestion than does complex and expensive food containing high protein and high complex carbohydrate. And of course, contributing also is the fact that we decrease the expenditure of calories in both the domestic setting and the workplace, and even by our central heating, we reduce the need for thermogenesis. I think together these are sufficient, I think, to explain the secular changes in the increase in prevalence of obesity. Although you'll find many people who will promulgate many other reasons, including antibiotics, for example, environmental pollutants, the antenatal environment, in other words, your mother making you fat, or social networks, your friends making you fat. And these are all possibilities. I don't discount them, but I think the data is really not in yet to be convincing that these things are really making a major contribution to the increase. There are a few quirky things that probably do make a little bit of an increase in the recent prevalence. That is that fat people tend to marry fat people, so-called assortative mating. And in most developed societies, obese women actually have more children than non-obese women. So there would be some sort of reshuffling of allelic frequencies by those sorts of distortions of normative mating. But why isn't everybody fat? In the face of an obesogenic environment, even in somewhere like Louisiana, there are plenty of lean people. So why isn't everybody fat? And really, there's broadly two explanations for why everybody isn't fat. One is that you just say the biology doesn't matter. It's all down to the environment, and therefore lean people make conscious choices. They're clever, they're smarter than fat people, and they make conscious choices to keep themselves thin. Or they just happen to be lucky and live in environments that promote leanness. Alternatively, we could say that maybe people have different underlying susceptibilities, and it doesn't matter where they live or what they try and do, they're impervious to environmental factors, or it could interact with environmental factors. And I hope in the next few minutes to convince you that almost certainly the only logical interpretation of the data is that people have profoundly different susceptibilities to obesity, and these interact profoundly with environmental factors to result in the obesity. And we know that there are biological factors because we have got a almost 100-year data set on how heritable obesity is. And by heritability, I mean the following. If I take this whole audience and march you outside and take the lean person right through to the fattest person, sadly, that's probably me, on one end, and then take two of you out and do a Merchant of Venice type experiment by taking all your fat and weighing it on a weighing scale, and say, what's the difference between person A and person B in kilograms of fat? 70% of that difference will be down to what you inherited from your parents, and we know that from almost 100 years of twin and identical twin studies, and that has not changed. These twin studies have been done just a few years ago in the UK, in 10,000 twin pairs, and the data is still the same. It's a highly heritable condition. In fact, we have this phenomenal data from Sweden, where in the 1950s and 60s, the sexual revolution preceded the contraceptive revolution, and there were lots of children born out of wedlock and lots of adoptions. And for some crazy reason, the Swedish adoption agencies decided that children could be twins could be separated and brought up by different adoptive families, and the twins were never told they were twins. So they were separated and brought up by different families. And an American psychiatrist, Mickey Stunkard, decided to study them at the age of around 30 to 35, assuming that it was the family environment that brought you up that would be the main determinant of what your weight was. That was where the food behaviors were taught, that's where your parents cooked, that's the siblings that you lived with. And the fact, to his astonishment, he found that your adult body mass index had no correlation to those of your siblings or family members. But the correlation to the identical twin that you had never seen was as high as 0.7, and in fact it was 0.7, and intermediate for the non-identical twin. And he concluded in this paper, to his astonishment, the genetic influences on body mass index are substantial, whereas the childhood environment has little or no influence. And that's counterintuitive, and indeed people find it profoundly shocking, but nonetheless this data set has never been challenged, and there's really very little you can say that could have confounded this data set. And if you're not convinced by data, maybe a picture helps a little bit. Here are some pairs of sisters. These are sisters born on the same day, but they share only 50% of their genes. So they're like brothers and sisters, like we all come in different shapes and sizes. Here are four pairs of sisters born on the same day, but sharing 100% of their genes. Now look at those pictures and tell me you don't think that genetics has anything to do with body fat or distribution. It would be pretty hard to argue against the evidence of your eyes about the profound influence of heritability on what your body mass index is. And of course, genes are not metaphysical objects. They're physical objects. They have to act through the universe. So how do they act? They have to act on either one or other side of this equation. It's really, obesity is a very simple problem. We can go home now because this is the end of the story, really, because obesity is all about energy stored is equal to energy intake minus energy expended. Of course, we can store that energy in different ways. We could store it as fat tissue, or we could store it as non-fat tissue. I've often dreamed that you could go out for a nice meal like tonight at Mugaritz, and instead of putting it into fat, you could put it into a vigorous beard growth in the morning. But unfortunately, we're not clever enough to do that. And of course, our fat tissue is a highly professional tissue designed exactly to expand itself so that it'll allow us to face periods of starvation into the future. Periods of starvation we, of course, rarely encounter nowadays. But we've evolved to have this highly professional tissue which is there to do precisely that job and to be a very efficient store of calories. And it's remarkable, really, given the sheer amount of food that we consume in a lifetime, that we are not all oscillating between supermodels and Luciano Pavarotti in every few months, because this is an astonishing amount of caloric intake and caloric expenditure for a relatively stable amount of body weight in the human organism. And that implied very early in the scientific times to people that there must be some sort of control over our energy stores. We can't be totally dependent on just what we fancy, what food is available, what we think we need to have. There must be some sort of regulation. And the first evidence that mammals' energy stores were controlled came from very simple experiments done both in the US and in the UK in the 1940s in rats. So rats keep growing all their life. So if you see a big rat, it's an old rat. So rats keep growing. And if you deprive a rat of half its rations, just give it a half food for a couple of weeks, it loses weight. Obviously, loses its fat stores, loses weight. And what Adolf and Kennedy and others did in that time was simply do that for 2 weeks and then put the rat back in a nice cage full of its normal nutrients. And the rat, of course, rapidly overate and went right back to exactly the trajectory that it was going to be on before, implying that it must have sensed that it was hungry, and it must have sensed that it needed to get back to that previous trajectory, and it did so. But that implies if you can sense something, you have to say, well, where is it being sensed? Where do we know this sensor is? And actually, the first clues to that came from human disease. It came from German physicians in the 19th century who had patients who were normal weight, and then in the middle of their lives suddenly started getting a tremendous appetite and becoming hugely obese, and being found at post-mortem to have tumors in the region of the brain called the hypothalamus, just above your nose up here. And those were the first clue that this brain area was likely to be very important in the control of body weight. And this was corroborated by experimental scientists in the 1950s and 60s, or 40s and 50s, who both took an electrolytic probes and lesioned this hypothalamus. So if you kill the middle of the hypothalamus, you get an animal that's overeats, that is very hyperphagic. But if you move your electrodes just a few sub-millimeters laterally and kill the lateral hypothalamus, you can create an animal that does not want to eat at all and will starve itself to death. So this was crucially in defining these areas of the hypothalamus as important for the control of body weight. I think the seminal and the initial experiment in the modern obesity era was one done by a British scientist, indeed in Cambridge, just a few miles from where I now work, who did an experiment using a technique called parabiosis, which is tricky. Certainly we can't do it in the UK anymore. And that is when you create artificial Siamese twins of rodents. Soon after birth, you partly sew the skin together of two genetically identical littermates rats, and then the circulating substances, hormones and signals, can move between the two animals. What Harvey did was he then did the lesioning damage to the hypothalamus of this rodent, creating an overeating, severely obese animal, and he observed that the parabiosed animal, the partner, became very thin and lost interest in eating and didn't bother to eat and became atrophic, really. So he suggested that in an obese state, there was a circulating substance that moved in the blood and suppressed food intake in the paired animal. And this was further developed in Bar Harbor, Maine, this laboratory in the States, which took all sorts of weird mice and kept them. It started from a group of Victorian mouse fanciers, knowing that with the prescience that these mice would be very useful for future science. And they got spontaneous obese mice, such as the OB mice. And what Doug Coleman did, just like Harvey 20 years before, he did this parabiosis experiment and showed that this obesity could be totally reversed by having some bloodstream from the normal animal, suggesting that this normal animal was providing a missing substance to the OB animal. Of course, science moves often when technology allows it to, and it took the power of modern molecular genetics and work of Jeff Friedman at Rockefeller to finally discover what was missing in that OB animal. Here's the animal. It's twice the body weight of its litter mates, and yet it has genetically identical apart from one mutation. And this mutation was in a remarkable peptide. Remember, back in the 1940s, 50s, etc., the fat cell was considered the dumbest cell in the world, a very, very unintelligent place where you just stored your fat and made you look ugly, and it was of little or no scientific interest. But suddenly it turned into an intelligent member of the neuroendocrine community, producing this substance leptin, uniquely producing leptin, which when the fat cell accumulates more fat, more leptin is produced. When you're starving, less leptin is produced, and leptin goes to the brain and decreases food intake, increases thermogenesis, even increases physical activity. So we have a brain that can sense how much and how sufficient our adipose stores are. What's true of leptin is it's probably more of a signal that transitions between the adequately nourished and the inadequately nourished state. It's a bit like Sherlock Holmes' dog that did not bark in the night, in that famous story where that was the clue to the criminal. In other words, when leptin goes away, that's when the spectacular signaling of seeking food, turning off the reproductive axis, etc., happens. When you have too much leptin, the signal is rather flat. Over the next few years, we've done a huge amount in this as a scientific community to dissect the biology of the downstream mechanisms of leptin action in the brain, these particular neurons in the ventromedial hypothalamus. I'll just mention, Charles talked about the power of small numbers of neurons in the brain. If you take these neurons, of which there are only 700 in the mouse brain, and you as an adult mouse kill off these neurons, you will create a mouse that will behave normally, will have sexual relations with other mice, will interact socially, will drink, but will never initiate a food-eating action again and will starve to death. So without these 700 neurons, no food intake, no motivation to eat food, a dead animal. So this is a tiny, and these are present in our brains in a similarly very, very, very tiny amount. So we share this mechanism with the mice. Up to then, it wasn't very clear whether we did share all these mechanisms, and that's where my own lab had been working on human genetics of metabolic disorders for many years, where we came in the mid to late 1990s and started finding human beings who had abnormalities in these systems, including children who were just like the OB mice, hugely hyperphagic, hugely obese from a young age, desperate for food, and they, too, were totally deficient in this hormone leptin. We also discovered individuals who lacked other downstream signals of leptin because they could not process those signals properly within the brain. And that led to an exciting era where we and others around the world decided that the situation which had happened previously, where very severely obese children was always assumed that it was parental mismanagement, that it was a socially determined condition. Our realization was that it could be biological, and we went looking for these children with severe early onset obesity, and we found time after time previously undescribed genetic conditions which led to the obesity in these children. And every time we found such a gene, it was generally very highly expressed in the brain, not particularly in adipose tissue. These weren't conditions where the adipose tissue was sucking in the fat. These were conditions where the gene was defective within this area, the ventromedial hypothalamus of the brain. One condition, defect in melanocortin-4 receptor, is actually pretty common. There are about 50,000 people in the UK who are obese because of this. If you look at obese children, severely obese children, somewhere around 5% of them will be obese precisely and only because they carry a mutation in this melanocortin-4 receptor, which prevents the next order signaling. Once leptin hits, goes to this gene POMC, this is the next receptor, and this is defective. So there'll be a similar number of people in Spain carrying this. If you look and see an obese child in the street, there's a reasonable likelihood that they will carry one of these mutations. Indeed, now with most of our genetic work in the last 10 years, we've managed to find a single gene cause in somewhere around 12% of the obese children that have been referred to us. So this is not rarities. These are cumulatively a reasonably decent number of people. So one of the important things to do when we discovered these genetic conditions many years ago was to ask, not just simply describe the gene and say it caused obesity, but try and understand how it was causing the obesity. And so we were able to take our children into our clinical research facility, just like people taking them into our mouse research facility, a highly sophisticated, controlled environment, and actually study their energetics and study their behavior in a controlled manner. And to our surprise, we found that actually the obesity in these children with these various conditions was being driven not so much, although it was subtly different, but not so much whether they burned calories slowly, but that these children all had a very abnormal appetite. They had massive food ingestion when provided with ad libitum meals, far more than they needed for their resting metabolic rate. You can see almost a threefold increase in food intake per kilogram lean mass in leptin deficiency. And rather remarkably, if you take the melanocortin-4 receptor mutations, put the mutation in vitro, measure how much cyclic AMP it generates, you could predict how much food intake these children would eat at a meal based on the dose-response characteristics of how well these mutations were working. So a remarkable correlation between a molecular signal and a complex human behavior, such as food ingestion. The great pleasure of this science particularly has been and particularly biomedical science, is when you can do something about it. And what's been fantastic for us is we've now got about 30 children with severe leptin deficiency in whom we've been able to give leptin and totally restore them to normal body weight. So now we do it much quicker. We can do it within 6 months usually, and have children who are almost wheelchair bound with obesity. And if they're truly leptin deficient, we can have them totally normal within 6 months. Leptin therapy has a profound effect on them, primarily on food intake. Within 3 days, their food intake has gone down 70%, gone down to 30% of baseline. So we totally normalize it within a matter of days. And of course, it's harder to do detailed controlled experiments in humans because we can't generate them like we can mice. But sometimes we have opportunities to do things. And with our neuroscience colleague Paul Fletcher, we were able to study the brains of 2 adolescents who had never had leptin before, show them pictures of food and non-food, so exciting things like money and cars didn't cause any lighting up of their areas of reward in the brain, but pictures of any food turned on areas like the nucleus accumbens, like showing a drug addict the paraphernalia of drug addiction. So this was a very powerful effect. And within 2 days of leptin administration, before they had lost any weight at all, these children had totally normalized the response to the visual presentation of food stimuli. So here is a simple hormone coming from this most boring of tissues, and yet it's telling what we think of as our higher brain. It's speaking rapidly and profoundly to areas we think we're in control of. But of course, this idea, the separation, the Cartesian dualism of separating a higher brain from lower is nonsense, because these are intimately associated. Our internal milieu signals are talking all the time to what we think of as our higher brain. I just thought I'd add, this is something new because I've been in touch with this patient, and in fact he gave me permission this morning just to put some of his recent emails to me, and because I thought it was very moving. Most of the children we've treated with leptin deficiency have been from ethnic groups whose languages, we had a lot of translation, it's been difficult to get. This is a very educated 30-year-old Italian man who has marginally detectable leptin concentrations and was very obese as a child, but has managed to control his obesity. And I'll just give you a few quotations from the correspondence we've had in the last. He says, "My problem is hunger without end, causing suffering and distress in every aspect of life. My hunger does not ever subside, even after eating. From an early age, my parents began to take me to the nutritionist, dietitian. They kept checking my food and trying to prevent access. I fought against obesity and hunger, but fighting my condition means suffering. It expends an enormous amount of energy, so that resisting the urge to eat all the time becomes the only occupation possible. This man has never been employed, but is highly educated, articulate, and writes English beautifully. He says, or else I give in to hunger, and this also precludes most activities, stunned by the food, with the continuing need to procure and consume. He said, the shame, the humiliation to be the bearer of what seems almost a curse, and telling us in terms of how he's been treated by health professionals, without a diagnosis, my dignity will continue to be trampled. So this is an example of how such a profound signal can have such a profound effect on the life of a person. So these genes and these products, do they just affect how much food we want to eat, or do they have any impact on what we want to eat? Well, recently, my colleague Sadaf Faruqi, who now leads our work in childhood obesity, and Paul Fletcher and others, we did some studies on our melanocortin-4 receptor deficient patients. We asked whether we could detect whether they had any particular preference for types of food. And our nutritional colleagues devised a wonderful chicken korma, this is an Indian dish, with very different amounts of fat, with low, medium, and high fat, which were undetectable in terms of liking, either before or after consumption, in terms of what people said they liked or could detect. But consistent with what has been found in rodents, when given free access to all three during in a buffet scenario, the people with the MC4 deficiency compared to equally obese controls had a much higher consumption of high fat. And indeed, when we did the same experiment using different sugar concentrations in a pudding in Eton Mess, they had a lower preference for sugar. So somehow this melanocortin-4 system seems to be tuned to very much to fat ingestion. And we're really just beginning to scratch the surface of the internal milieu's control or influence on nutrient choice. One piece of work that's not ours, it comes from other groups in the US, has pretty compellingly shown that this liver-derived hormone, FGF21, is a powerful suppressor of sugar and alcohol intake, but not of complex carbohydrates or fat. And indeed, in the human genome, polymorphisms around FGF21 are one of the strongest associates with whether you ask the question you prefer sugary or sweet foods. In the 23andMe, the commercial genomics organization, this vast database, FGF21 SNPs are among the highest associated with the preference for sweet food. So we have this system designed to let us know about the state of our fat stores, signaling through leptin and the melanocortin system. But this is a very slow-acting system. It's a tonic, long-acting system. The changes in leptin have influences over days rather than over hours. But we, of course, need to have other information about when we should when we should stop a meal once we've initiated it. And over the last few years, we've become aware of a range of gut-derived hormones, including ghrelin from the stomach, which is pro-eating. It's an orexigenic hormone. It stimulates food intake. And a range of peptides from the large and small intestine, which go up after a meal and suppress food intake when given to people. We've made a recent contribution added to this catalog ourselves recently by discovering a peptide of the relaxin family called insulin-like peptide 5 in work we've done with Fiona Gribble and Johannes Gross from Takeda, which is highly expressed in the colon, and yet, like ghrelin, is the only gut-derived hormone we know so far that actually stimulates food intake when administered to animals, and when we give an antibody to it, we can block, at least partially block, the refeeding response after a period of starvation. So these gut hormones are coming into therapy. The only really successful or reasonably successful obesity medicine that's recently been licensed is an altered form of one of those hormones, GLP-1, which does have sustained beneficial effects and nearly 10% weight loss maintained over years in patients on it. And of course, the other area where gut hormones are enormously important is in the effect of weight loss surgery. Gastric banding is a very bad and very non-persistent. It doesn't work very well, but other forms of gastric bariatric surgery work extremely well and are very persistent in their effect on weight. And I'd like to counter what's a common misconception. It's a common misconception among doctors, but particularly the lay public. This bariatric surgery does not do either restriction or malabsorption. What I mean is it allows food down perfectly well into your gut. In fact, it bypasses the pylorus, which is a much tighter sphincter. So it's nothing to do with food not being able to get down into your gut when you swallow and eat it. You've got a free run down into your small intestine. Nor do you malabsorb food. You've got adequate amounts of intestine to absorb all the nutrients that you ingest, certainly all the macronutrients. How bariatric surgery works is it causes an intense change in the milieu and in these postprandially ingested hormone signals, the gut signals, including GLP-1, PYY, and others, which together give you a sensation of fullness much more rapidly into the meal than you previously had. And therefore, meal size is much smaller, and this persists, and the efficacy of it persists long into after the surgery. And therefore, it is by far the most successful current treatment for severe obesity. So how relevant is the stuff I've been telling you to common obesity? How relevant is it to the variation of body mass index in this room, for example? Well, we now know from work that we've done and many others in collaboration, and indeed led by people like Ruth Lewis and Nick Wareham from our own institute, who have worked on nearly 500,000 people, looking at common genetic variation around the population and looking at common variants that reliably have an effect on body mass index. And many of them overlap with genes that we've discovered where major mutations cause severe obesity. Subtle variation in this population around this room is having an influence on BMI across the room. But perhaps more interestingly is to ask, what does that genetic landscape look like? If we just simply said, what are the variants around this room that influence people's amount of fat tissue you have? And when we look at those genes, where are they most likely to be expressed most highly, and where are they having their effect? And you can do that using bioinformatic, very sophisticated bioinformatic tools, and you can ask, are those genes endocrine, major expression in the endocrine, are they in the musculoskeletal, are they in the fat tissue? Where are they predominantly expressed? And it's remarkable. These genes are almost exclusively CNS dominant genes. So the vast majority of the genes that are around the population in this room, the genetic variants are present in all of you. These are influencing your BMI through your brain. And that could be through food intake, it could be partially through energy expenditure, but it fits with what we learned from the monogenic disorders. Intriguingly, if you ask the same question about where you put your fat, have you got a fat belly or a fat bum, a fat backside, the genes are totally different. Those genes don't overlap, and almost none of them are expressed in the central nervous system. Most of those genes are genes concerned with mesenchymal tissue and differentiation of adipose tissue. So where the amount of fat we store tends to be essentially a very simple take-home message. The amount of fat is a brain thing, and where we put our fat is a below-the-neck question for our organism. Pulling this all together, there's some lovely work by my Jane Wardle, who very sadly died earlier this year, far too young. And she did wonderful work in both twins, but also in normal children in London. She developed a highly used childhood eating behavior questionnaire, which many of you in this institute may use. It's very reliable. It's been highly validated against measured food intake. And what one of Jane's early publications showed that indications such as food responsiveness in her questionnaire or satiety responsiveness, these questions are like, if your child has eaten a snack, will that suppress them from having their next meal? These strongly relate to whether the child is underweight or clinically obese, and again, does the food responsiveness questionnaires. But now with genetics, we can come in and ask, those genes that we and others have discovered, do these underpin these relationships in childhood? And indeed they do. So the genes in her childhood populations, the more risk alleles for those genes you have, the heavier you are and the higher you are on the BMI scan, and they're closely related to particularly the satiety responsiveness. So these genes are affecting obesity through the medium of satiety. Some children are easily satiated, others are not easily satiated. So a very simple model, and this sort of counters people who are skeptical about biology and say, well, in famines or in terrible concentration camp, nobody was obese. Well, of course that's true, because you need energy intake to become obese. But quite simply, if there's famine, there's no obesity, full stop. If there's limited food supply, only a very small number of very susceptible people are going to be obese. But where we are now is we're in the midst of food abundance, as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk. And there we have extremely susceptible individuals who find it very hard to use higher cognitive processes to restrain their natural biology in the face of these powerful, powerful influences. In my last 2-3 slides, I'm just going to mention a little bit about diabetes. I'm not really going to show you any original data, because I do find, again, when I talk to general audiences, there's a kind of assumption that obesity and diabetes are the same thing, that because there's a correlation, the more obese you are, the higher the risk you have of diabetes. It's a linear relationship. Of course, it isn't. Many obese people don't have diabetes, and many mildly obese people do have diabetes. And I'll just give you a useful model, I think, that some colleagues have found useful. It's the bathroom model I call the sodden bathroom carpet model, or the wet carpet model of metabolic disease. So you can think of a bathroom where the plug is out of the bathroom, out of the bathtub, and you have this energy intake and energy expenditure, and the amount of fat you store in your adipose tissue is here, but you still have free capacity at the top of the bath where there's no stored fat. And of course, what we normally think about in obesity-associated metabolic disease is that we either increase the intake or we decrease the expenditure, or we do both. And of course, in those situations, we fill up our bath and we spill out. And this nasty, rotten, stinky carpet is what we get when we get our metabolic disease. And that's in effect when we're putting the lipid that should be stored in our adipose tissue, we're actually putting that lipid into muscle and liver and places that it should not be. And that's where it messes up glucose metabolism. And in work that we've done, genetic work with our colleagues Nick Wareham and David Savage and Inez Brosa, just about to be published in Nature Genetics, what's really struck us is actually the commonest scenario leading to obesity-related metabolic disease is not so much this massive increase in intake and expenditure, but most people susceptible to diabetes have a small bath. So the commonest genetic underpinning of insulin resistance in the population are individuals who are unable to expand their adipose capacity in the face of excessive energy intake versus energy expenditure. And so at very small levels of imbalance, they rapidly develop the metabolic complications because they are unable to generate new fat cells and fat cell stores. And I don't have time to show you the raw data for that, but we believe it's reasonably compelling. I'm not showing you a figure, but you'll have read in newspapers often of these massively obese individuals who had the police and the fire brigade have to come in and knock the wall of the house down and take those people into hospital. They're so huge. Those people never have diabetes because they have an enormous bath. And that's why they've become so large and so vast, because they have not decompensated to develop diabetes, because if they did, they would then start losing all the calories in their urine of glucose, and they would start getting slimmer and lose the weight. So I think it's a very useful model to think of, and it's useful when you're thinking about what you might do to help people. We have a national clinic for people with difficult to manage diabetes, and sometimes, or quite often, there are women like this. This is a woman you can see, she's quite centrally obese, but she really doesn't store much fat, or very little, on the legs, hips, but she has profoundly insulin-resistant, terribly badly controlled diabetes. She's at risk of going blind, of losing her legs, of amputation. She's at risk of renal failure, very sick indeed, on hundreds of units of insulin a day. So what did we do to make her better? Even though she's not profoundly obese, she only has a BMI, just 30 is obese, she's mildly obese by my BMI criteria. But what we did was we convinced her to undergo bariatric surgery. Within just 3 months, she had almost normal blood glucose levels, 23 down to 7, the hemoglobin A1C, the glycosylated down to 6.7. You can see how much weight she's lost, utterly transformed, off all medication because of this surgical procedure. So that sounds a pretty drastic procedure, and it is. But what I'd like to encourage our scientists here in the audience to do is to try and understand the science of this gut-brain axis better, so that we don't have to subject people to surgical procedures to try and understand what the gut and how the gut is talking to the brain and what we can do to manipulate that. And of course, I'd like to talk to our chefs, because I can see a scenario where we very cleverly use what we deliver through the mouth to the gastrointestinal tract to exploit the existence of these mechanisms, delivering us beautiful food, but food that allows us to be satiated at an early stage and does not encourage us to continue to consume to pathological degrees. So thank you for your attention.